Women's suffrage was the unfair treatment of women in topics like political and economical equality around the middle to late 1800s. These women were obviously upset about being treated unfair, and they wanted to fight for reform and change of these laws. This led to various women creating national organizations that led to aid their cause, such as the International Women's Suffrage Alliance and the American Equal Rights Association. The leaders of these organizations were all very brave and powerful women they devoted their lives to trying to improve their rights of their fellow women in the U.S. Some well-known organization leaders were Lucy Stone, who was the leader of the American Suffrage Alliance, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony of the American Equal Rights Association. Besides the many organizations, there are many various newspaper publications like the Women's Journal and the Women's Tribune, who both wrote about women's struggles and helped to promote more fair treatment to women in the U.S. It's unrefutable that women's rights were a huge issue in this time period and something needed to be done. But with the creation of all the organizations, publications, petitions, movements, and many more things, women finally were able to gain their right to vote.
Women's suffrage movement in the beginning of the 19th century was very important to the development of the United States. Even though women were still considered weaker than men, the women's suffrage movement lived on all the way into the beginning of the 20th century. This also set a precedent of women being involved in politics. Although the women's rights movement died out a little before the Civil War, following the Civil War, it reignited and eventually earned the woman the right to vote, which helped women gain more rights through voting. Following the Second Great Awakening and the increased female role in religion, it was only logical that women would play a greater role in politics as social issues and religious issues went hand in hand. One example of women's rights helping the United States grow is providing more education for women. An example of this is the founding of the Oberlin College, which was the first coeducational college in America. This helped our country produce even more educated citizens, develop knowledge, and contribute great female scientists. Although more educated women helped slow the birth rate down later in the century, this helped the development of smaller families where children would receive more attention and resources towards their development.
According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, sectionalism is the exaggerated devotion to the interests of a region. This is seen throughout history as people are more likely to agree with society to not stand out. As the women's suffrage movement spread throughout the United States, it influenced the sectionalism of certain areas. If a region's political leaders, as well as other influential figures, are vocally passionate about an issue, the region will tend to fall into agreement. That being said, there were certain areas of the United States during this time that supported this movement, as well as regions that were opposed. Regions of the United States that had full suffrage included the West as well as the middle of the country, while several eastern and southern states had no suffrage at all. The regions of the country were mostly congruent with their views on this issue. The West, with a more open-minded view on human rights, differed from the South, where they upheld a traditional belief system in regards to issues such as slavery as well as the women's suffrage movement.
The women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement were both social struggles that moved the nation in the direction of universal equality. The women's suffrage movement preceded the civil rights movement as its peak activity was in between 1890 and 1920s, which was also called the women's era because of economic and political opportunities that opened up for them. The civil rights movement's peak activity was in between 1850 and late 1860s, which was called the period of consensus because of the general prosperity among the white Americans. Both groups have been pushing for their goals long before the time periods often connected to them. It's just that those years were the most progressive. Each group had their figureheads. For the women's suffrage movement, it was Frances Willard, who led the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Florence Kelley, who founded the National Consumer League. But for the civil rights movement, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most popular speech, I Have a Dream, was part of America's largest public demonstration. Both movements' efforts were rewarded with legal policies. The women's suffrage movement motivated the federal government to passing the 19th Amendment, and the civil rights movement success was materialized in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.